title of this talk is Demystifying Non-Self, the Joy of Disappearing. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on how to make the Buddha's teaching on non-self accessible. This is my latest attempt, so here goes. Let me start with the first important point. You are a process, a constantly changing process. Admittedly, you're a complicated process, but that is how you are. The Buddha identified us as being the 5 khandhas in Pali, or skandhas in Sanskrit. These are 1. The body, 2. Feelings, or more precisely feeling tones, 3. Perceptions, 4. Mental formations, which are thoughts and emotions, and 5. Consciousness. But for our purposes, we can simplify all this into mind and body. And both the mind and body are constantly changing. The cells in the body are constantly being replaced, for example. Current thinking is that the average lifespan of any cell in the body is 7 to 10 years. The same is true for the mind, although the mind is, of course, much more complicated. Your mind is not where it was even 20 seconds ago. This is one way in which the mind is constantly changing. But it also happens over time, although our conditioning is very deep. This is why you hear some people say, people never change. But that is not the Buddhist view. Let's look at 2 different ways in which people change over time. The first way in which people change is the most common way. We're all born with certain conditioning, personality traits, and characteristics. Left unguarded, these traits are reinforced. They become stronger. I knew someone once who had a lot of anger. When she was 20, she had a certain amount of anger. It was part of her conditioning, which is another way of saying her personality. But she lacked self-awareness, mindfulness, and a desire to change. And as she got older, her anger was increasingly reinforced. So her anger was not static. Every time she got angry, it reinforced her predisposition for anger. And the next time she got angry, it came more easily and was more forceful. By the time she was 80, no one could stand to be around her. She was angry all the time. Thich Nhat Hanh used to call our mind states seeds. This is a good analogy. And we can choose which seeds to water. So in this case, where there is anger, the anger may arise, but you can use mindfulness to see it, and when you get skillful at it, you can abandon it. Eventually, you can get to the point where the anger either doesn't manifest at all, or it simply arises and passes away. I heard this story about the legendary Thai forest Ajahn, Ajahn Chah. Now, in Buddhist psychology, there are 3 basic personality types. There are those rooted in craving, those rooted in aversion, and those rooted in ignorance. These are the famous 3 poisons. We all have all 3 defilements, of course, but usually there's one that is dominant. One day, Ajahn Chah was sitting with a lay supporter, and he happened to mention that he had an aversive personality type and that he had a lot of anger. His lay supporter was quite surprised. He said to Ajahn Chah, "I've known you for 10 years, and I've never seen you get angry." Ajahn Chah replied, "The anger arises, but it has nowhere to go." This is a wonderful example of using mindfulness and training to change our conditioning. To be sure, this does not happen easily or quickly. Our conditioning is like one of those super tankers that takes many miles to change course. It requires patience, and it requires persistence. So the point is this: the mind and body are constantly changing. There's nothing permanent about either one. Left unguarded, that can be a problem. We simply reinforce bad behaviors. But the good news is that process can change. It can be reprogrammed. And that is what Buddhist practice is all about. The fact that we are a process is good news. The Buddha gave us a roadmap of what qualities to develop and which ones to abandon. The most common formula starts with generosity as a basis for the 5 precepts: non-harming, not stealing, refraining from sexual misconduct, abstaining from false speech, and abstaining from intoxication. I would add that gratitude acts as the basis for generosity. Buddhist monastics have only the simplest possessions, and yet they live lives of gratitude. This is because they have found the Dharma, and the Dharma is priceless. Another set of guidance that the Buddha gives us, is the third, fourth, and fifth factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. These are right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Yet a third set of useful guidance is the perfections. This is a later formulation, but it comes from the Buddha's teachings. The perfections are generosity, virtue, renunciation, wisdom, patience, persistence, honesty, determination, loving kindness, and equanimity. But if you're going to remember only one quality, that would be kindness. If you act out of kindness for yourself and others, you will be on the right road. Conversely, the qualities to be abandoned are the three poisons. That would start with greed, craving, and clinging. Then there is aversion. Aversion directed inwards includes fear, anxiety, and depression. Aversion directed outwards includes hatred and anger. Then there's the third poison, ignorance. This generally means ignorance of the Four Noble Truths or an ignorance of the law of karma. That is, that wholesome actions have wholesome results and unwholesome actions have unwholesome results. So we have certain types of conditioning, but because that conditioning is not permanent, we can work with it. We can train our minds to be more skillful. In that way, we can reduce suffering and stress for ourselves and others. In fact, we can do better than that. We can make ourselves more useful and beneficial. Using the Buddha's advice on good qualities to cultivate and unwholesome qualities to abandon, coupled with mindfulness and effort, we can nudge that supertanker into a more wholesome direction. The fact that nothing about us is permanent and unchanging, i.e., not self, is good news. We're more like a lump of clay than a rock, and using the Buddha's guidance, we can discover our inner Michelangelo and make something beautiful. This understanding in the Noble Eightfold Path comes under the first factor, right view. We always start with right view, right understanding. Then we put that understanding into practice. But before we leave the area of right understanding, I'd like to make an important point about the Buddha's teaching, and that is that the Buddha famously only taught what is necessary for us to end suffering. He wasn't trying to make philosophical statements about the nature of the universe, for example, unless they contributed to the need to end suffering. And this is true in the case of anatta, non-self. He never made a direct statement about the existence or the non-existence of the self. I heard a meditation teacher say point blank, the self doesn't exist and it never did. Now, he may believe that, but this is not something the Buddha ever said. There's only one time in the Pali Canon where the Buddha was asked directly whether the self exists or not. This is in the Anatta Sutta, which is Sutta 44.10 in the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses of the Buddha. I would like to read the entire sutta to you. Don't worry, it's short. Then the wanderer Vāshagoda went to the Blessed One and, on arrival, exchanged courteous greetings with him. After an exchange of friendly greetings and courtesies, he sat to one side. As he was sitting there, he asked the Blessed One, "Now then, Venerable Gautama, is there a self?" When this was said, the Blessed One was silent. "Then there is no self?" A second time, the Blessed One was silent. Then Vāshagoda the wanderer got up from his seat and left. Then not long after Vāshagoda the wanderer had left, Venerable Ananda said to the Blessed One, "Why, Lord, did the Blessed One not answer when asked a question by Vāshagoda the wanderer?" "Ananda, if I, being asked by Vāshagoda the wanderer, if there is a self, were to answer that there is a self, that would be conforming with those Brahmins and contemplatives who are exponents of eternalism. That's the view that that there's an eternal, unchanging soul. If I, being asked by Vashagota the Wanderer if there is no self, were to answer that there is no self, that would be conforming with those Brahmins and contemplatives who are exponents of annihilationism. That's the view that death is the annihilation of consciousness, that's the end. If I, being asked by Vashagota the Wanderer if there is a self, were to answer that there is a self, would that be in keeping with the arising of knowledge that all phenomena are not self? No, Lord. And if I, being asked by Vashagota the Wanderer if there is no self, were to answer that there is no self, the bewildered Vashagota would become even more bewildered. Does the self I used to have now not exist? I've always been intrigued by this last paragraph. What he talks about is what his answer might do to the mind of Vashagota. This is so typical of the Buddha's practicality as a teacher. Now, I think you can see here that the Buddha would not agree with the statement that the self does not exist. Now, you will hear some people say that the issue of whether the self exists or not is not relevant to the ending of suffering. You will also hear those same people say that after you are fully enlightened, the issue is also irrelevant. I would be one of those people, and I hope I can be more clear about that in the remainder of this talk. So, once again, to summarize, the Buddha's teaching was always about freeing yourself from suffering. It was about conditionality, and it was about cultivating the wholesome and abandoning the unwholesome. And apropos of non-self, this is why he never went into detail about the existence or the non-existence of the self. This is an academic, philosophical question that does not have any value in ending suffering. In the Buddha's teaching, non-self is a strategy. Let me say that again. Non-self is a strategy. It's a way to help us find our way out of suffering, and it's a way to cultivate the wholesome and abandon the unwholesome. And that brings us to part 2 of this talk, and that is developing a healthy sense of self. Now we move into the practical realm of practice. It may come as a surprise that the Buddha taught developing a healthy sense of self and trusting in yourself, especially since there's so much attention given to non-self. But he did talk about it. Before you can realize non-self, you must have a healthy sense of self. This is a path of training. You go through stages. To be sure, eventually you will abandon a sense of self. In fact, you can get tastes of that abandonment here and there. It isn't all or nothing. But along the way, you must develop confidence. You must be self-assured. This is a challenging path. Anyone who's tried to practice metta for the folks in Washington knows this. And if you're going to complete the path, you must believe that you can do it. You must believe that it is possible for you to do it. It is one of the planks in the raft that gets you to the far shore. This is a passage from the Dhammapada in which the Buddha addresses this topic. Your own self is your own mainstay. For who else could your mainstay be? With you yourself, well trained, you obtain a mainstay hard to obtain. In the Parinibbana Sutta, which is Digha Nikaya 16, there's a lovely passage in which the Buddha addresses this topic further. The context for this exchange is that the Buddha is dying. His attendant, Ananda, is quite distraught. Ananda is one of the most endearing people in the Buddha's life. At this point, the Buddha is 80 years old, and Ananda has been his attendant for 25 years. And for all his accomplishments, Anatta is not fully enlightened, which is why he is distraught. In this exchange, Anatta asked the Buddha who will be appointed to lead the Sangha when the Buddha dies. The Buddha famously refuses to name a successor. He says this instead. Therefore, Anatta, you should live as islands unto yourselves, being your own refuge, with no one else as your refuge, with the Dharma as an island, with the Dharma as your refuge, with no other refuge. One thing I love about this passage is that the Pali word that's translated here as island also means lamp. The passage works equally well with either definition. I think the Buddha used this word intentionally. He was a master wordsmith, and in this case, he is telling us to be our own island and our own lamp. The Buddha is telling us to be self-reliant. We have our map, our guide, and that is the Buddha's teachings. They have been preserved by the Sangha for 2,500 years in the Pali Canon. Today, miraculously, they're available online for free. We only need to study the map and trust ourselves to put it into practice. We have everything we need. We have life's guidebook, we have our hearts, and we have our minds. So how do we cultivate this healthy sense of self? We do this through virtue. Once again, in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, happiness is virtue lasting through old age. It's such a lovely phrase, and it's one of my favorites in the Pali Canon. The Pali word for what I call virtue is sila. It's usually translated as ethics or morality, and as you can see, I prefer the word virtue, which has a more positive connotation. For cultural reasons, the word morality can conjure up a pretty negative response. When my son was in college, he took a class on ethics and morality. I was pretty excited about that because of what I learned from Buddhism about ethics. Unfortunately, his teacher taught ethics and morality in a mind-numbingly depressing way. His view was that ethics and morality are something that we must do, but that they are burdensome. They are a cross that we must bear. The Buddha's teachings could not be more different. Virtuous behavior brings us joy and happiness. Doing things for others makes us feel good about ourselves. My son's teacher was a Quaker. He was probably thinking about the proverbial case of hiding Jews from Nazis or something like that. And while this may be a bit of a stretch for some of you, from a Buddhist standpoint, even if they kill you, you have a good rebirth. You end up in heaven, a Deva realm, with kind, good, and virtuous beings. The Buddha's birth mother, Maya Devi, and his biggest lay supporter, Anatta, were reborn in the Tusita heaven. Given the lifetimes in that realm, they're probably still there. How cool is that? You could get to hang out and practice with Maya Devi and Anatta. Okay, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but it is something to consider. In Buddhism, virtue is associated with being noble. In the Buddha's teachings, anyone who practices virtue is called a disciple of the noble ones. And I would argue that being virtuous and noble is a lot more important than being killed by some Nazi. Now, obviously, you don't want to overdo the self-identification with virtue, so keep an eye on that. Try not to let that become a problem. But let me get back to the issue of a healthy sense of self and confidence. Some years ago, I was doing research on stream entry, which is the first of the 4 stages of awakening. In Pali, the word is sotapanna. I was familiar with the teachings in the Majjhima Nikaya about stream entry. The Majjhima Nikaya is the second of the 5 collections in the Pali Canon. Most people, and I'm one of them, consider it to be the most important of the 5 collections. When I want to research something, I will usually go there first. In the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha gives a formula for the stages of awakening. He lists 10 fetters, and in stream entry, the disciple overcomes the first three of them. These fetters are 1. Self-identity view, which we're working our way up to. 2. Attachment to rites and rituals. And 3. Skeptical doubt, that is, skeptical doubt in the Buddha's teaching. But then I went to the Samyutta Nikaya. The Samyutta Nikaya is the third collection. Samyutta means connected. The discourses in the Samyutta Nikaya are organized by theme, and one of the themes is stream entry. I was expecting to see a reiteration of the formula in the Majjhima Nikaya. But what I found instead was a different formula. In the Samyutta Nikaya, stream entry is achieved by attaining 4 qualities. These are 1. Complete confidence in the Buddha, which equates to the third fetter. Complete confidence in the Dhamma. Complete confidence in the Sangha. And this is the one that caught me off guard. Confidence in virtue. The wording of this is so interesting. First, the Buddha does not say that you have mastered virtue. That won't come until you're fully enlightened. Even then, not everything you do will turn out perfectly. They didn't always turn out perfectly for the Buddha either, so expecting that is a pretty high bar. But you will have confidence in the practice of virtue, that virtue is good, that it is important. And by practicing virtue, you will develop a healthy sense of self. You will be a good person, and you will be secure and confident in that. You won't question whether the right thing, doing the right thing, is a problem. As I like to say, doing the right thing is always the right thing. And while I may be overusing an extreme example, I recently heard a story about hiding Jews from Nazis. Apparently, this story made its way through Buddhist circles after the Second World War. There was a man in either Denmark or the Netherlands who was hiding Jews. Since I'm part Dutch, I like to say it was in the Netherlands, but it may have been Denmark. In any event, the Gestapo showed up one day to search his house. Now, as you may know, one of the precepts, perhaps the most important precept, is against lying, even telling little white lies. And this man was devout in his Buddhism. So when the Gestapo showed up at his door, he knew he could not lie. So he enthusiastically said to the commanding officer, please, come in. I have nothing to hide." And of course, from his perspective, this was true. The Gestapo officer was so impressed that he apologized, and the Gestapo went on their way. Okay, so it doesn't always happen this way. Sometimes the Nazis shoot you, but it's a wonderful story. We can be kind in so many simple ways. You can thank the person who bags your groceries. You can smile at the young mom taking her baby for a walk in a stroller. It doesn't have to be ending world hunger, which you can't do anyway. Look for ways you can help. Maybe you can make somebody's day in a simple way. I want to change gears here a little and talk about a problem in Western Buddhism. Sila is the base of the path. Not practicing, seriously, right conduct is like building a skyscraper on a foundation of gravel. In Asia, lay people primarily practice Sila. Their practice is centered around the temple or a monastery. The lay people first and foremost care for the monastics and the temples and monasteries. I have a story about this. In Western Australia, there's a monastery called Bodhinyana. It is about an hour's drive from Perth. Their regular routine is for lay people from Perth to drive to the monastery every day in order to give alms food to the monks. There's a companion nunnery called Dhammasara where the same thing happens. After this alms ritual, the lay people get to hang out with the monks, socialize, talk, ask questions, and so on. But during the pandemic, this was not allowed. Nonetheless, every day, people in Perth prepared the food, drove the hour to the monastery, dropped off the food, and turned right around and returned to Perth. This went on for over 2 years. More than once I heard Dharma talks by Ajahn Brahmali, who's the vice abbot, about how humbled and overwhelmed he was by the generosity of the lay community. So the lay practice in Asia is primarily like this. But in the U.S., it's not like that. We focus on meditation and going to retreats and activities like that. But as a result, the behavior in many Buddhist groups can be quite poor, and I'm being generous. I've heard stories about this from a number of Asian teachers, and they all have the same theme. I will tell you the one that I heard from Sharon Salzberg many years ago. She and Joseph Goldstein had just opened the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. I think IMS had been there for about a year. So they invited one of their Burmese teachers to come and run a retreat, which he did. About halfway through the retreat, Sharon and Joseph said to their Burmese teacher, "Isn't it wonderful to see this Asian tradition taking root in America?" He hesitated and finally answered, "Yes, it is nice to see, but what I see is people working earnestly to experience exalted states of meditation, but they're not always very nice to each other. It's as if they're in a rowboat, madly rowing, but they forget to untie the boat from the dock. If you do nothing else in this life, work on being kind and generous and helpful. You're better off being a Christian or a Jew or an atheist and being a good person than you are reading the discourses and meditating, but not treating people very nicely." When you work with developing good qualities, you go through stages. At first, you'll have to consciously pay attention to them. You'll have to look for opportunities to help. After a while, it will become more reflexive. You will just do what is required, and you will get joy, happiness, and satisfaction out of that. But finally, and this is the non-self part, there won't be any you doing it at all. You will be a conduit through which wholesome actions manifest. This is very liberating. The sense of self is a speed bump. It interferes just slightly with the joy, happiness, and satisfaction of virtue. By removing it, the experience is pure. There is no you, there is just the joy. And that brings us to the third part of this talk, the joy of disappearing. Now I want to talk about how letting go of a sense of self can help us in our daily lives. I will start with negative mind states. When we feel something unpleasant in the body or the mind, there is, of course, the unpleasantness of the experience. In the body, we can feel pain, for instance, or we can simply feel tired or something like that. So that's the raw experience. Then there is what the mind does with that experience. All of us have probably known people who, at the slightest discomfort, act as if the world were coming to an end. Conversely, we have known people who experience something very painful and they barely react. They may even make fun of it or laugh at it. Some years ago, my daughter went hiking with her husband in Scotland. She got food poisoning, and as you can imagine, being stuck in an Airbnb for 2 days in another country with food poisoning is not much fun. But when they told me this story, all they could do was laugh about it. I was pretty impressed. The Buddha talked about this in a famous simile of his. It is called the Salata Sutta. That's S-A-L-L-A-T-A. Salata Sutta, it means the arrow. Here are a couple of paragraphs from that sutta. Monks, an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person feels feelings of pleasure, feelings of pain, feelings of neither pleasure nor pain. A well-instructed disciple of the noble ones also feels feelings of pleasure, feelings of pain, feelings of neither pleasure nor pain. So what difference, what distinction, what distinguishing factor is there between the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones and the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person? When touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental, just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterward were to shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pains of two arrows. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental. Now, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones, when touched with a feeling of pain, does not feel sorrow, grieve, or lament, does not beat his breast or become distraught. So he feels one pain, physical but not mental. Just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterwards did not shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pain of only one arrow. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones does not sorrow, grieve, or lament, does not beat his breast or become distraught. He feels one pain, physical but not mental. This, of course, does not have to be a bodily pain. It could be a mental pain as well, an unpleasant memory or experience. Part of the problem in terms of the self is that we self-identify with the unpleasant experience. This is sometimes called selfing. It's not just that it's happening to me. This is part of that second arrow. And if we can let go of that self-identification with the unpleasant experience, the pain doesn't go away, but it is certainly diminished. There's less stress and suffering. I've even heard about extreme cases where people had quite serious mental disorders like schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder. And by disidentifying with it, not thinking that I am this or that, the problem doesn't go away, but it loses some of its power over you. Part of the problem may be that we think of the mind as being this one monolithic thing. But the mind has many parts and they don't always agree. The great Ajahn Lee used to say that the mind is like a committee, and not a well-functioning one at that. If you think of the mind in that way, you can encourage the skillful parts of the mind and diminish or ignore the less skillful parts of the mind. I heard this story about the head of the most successful psychiatric hospital in Asia for treating schizophrenia. The head of the hospital was asked, "How do you treat schizophrenia?" He said, "We don't. We treat the rest of the patient." Admittedly, this process of disidentification is not easy. This is a training and our habits are deeply ingrained, but we can learn to pull back a little and watch what the mind is doing. This makes the experience a little more objective, a little less personal, and a little less daunting. In Zen, they sometimes call this pulling back mind watching mind. It is also called the inner observer. To be sure, a lot of the time, even most of the time, the mind will just do what it does, but you can watch it and not feel so threatened. In fact, it is sometimes quite comical to see how the mind latches onto something negative over and over and over again. After a while, even you get tired of it. As my daughter likes to say, cue the eye roll. Another aspect to how the mind grabs onto negative experiences is to understand how memory works. Our conventional memory is completely unreliable. Defense attorneys will tell you this. The worst kind of evidence to have is an eyewitness. I had this rather strange experience years ago with my mother and my aunt. When this happened, they were both in their late 70s. My mother told me a story about something unpleasant that had happened to her when she was a child. Then 6 months later, my aunt told me a story from about that same time period. I didn't think much about it at the time. But about 2 months later, I realized that they were describing the same event. If you didn't know the two of them, you would never have been able to figure that out. The stories were completely different, but they had held on to this painful memory for over 60 years. And what they were holding on to and suffering from was a distorted fiction. Memory experts will tell you that the first time you remember something, that is about as close as you will ever get to what actually happened. The next time you remember something, you don't remember what actually happened, you remember the memory of the previous memory of what happened. And every time you remember the event, you remember the previous memory, and it gets a little more distorted. And as you can imagine, over time the story becomes more in your favor and less in favor of whoever else was involved. So it really helps to have some skepticism about your memories. It's certainly one reason to hold painful memories lightly. So that is how releasing or completely letting go of a sense of self can reduce or eliminate painful experiences. So now let's talk about the other side of the coin, pleasant experiences. As with negative mind states, we can have pleasurable ones. And in those pleasant mind states, there's usually a sense of I. I am happy. I am joyful, and so on. But if you can let go of the sense of I, the experience becomes pure. The idea of a self is a hindrance in the pleasant experience. By letting it go, some subtle stress goes away, and the joy is greater. This may sound strange, but I think almost everyone has had this type of experience. You're working on something. Maybe it's a craft or art or cleaning house. It doesn't really matter. And while you're doing what you're doing, this sense of self disappears. There's no doer, just the doing. At some point you look up and realize that hours have passed, and you hardly know where the time went. The problem from a Buddhist perspective is that we don't foster or encourage these mind states. But this is something to which we want to pay attention. We want to encourage this selfless sense of joy, happiness, and so on. These mind states are very pleasant and they're very liberating. One of my favorite places to go in New Mexico is Jemez Falls. The first time I went there, it was a beautiful New Mexico summer day. The sky was blue, the sunshine was vibrant, there was a slight breeze. For those of you who have been there, you know there are places to sit. There were about a half dozen people. It was almost reverent. No one was speaking. It seemed sacrilegious. So there was just the sound of the wind and the birds and the water cascading into the Jemez River. And as I sat there, the notion of self completely disappeared. There was just the timeless serenity, peace, and tranquility of the place. In the 8th century, the Chinese poet Li Bai wrote, "The birds have vanished down the sky. Now the last cloud drains away. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains." This is non-self at its best. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, there is no happiness higher than peace. As long as there is a sense of self, that peace is compromised. This is why people say that when you become enlightened, the issue of whether or not there's a self is irrelevant. If all you are is peace, calm, tranquility, contentment, and happiness, who cares whether or not there is a self? This brings me to my final point. This may be a little hard to wrap your head around, so don't feel discouraged if it does not make sense to you at the moment. All of these practices take time. Sometimes you can hear the same teaching 1,000 times, and then one day it suddenly feels clear. So let me descend into the world of samadhi. Samadhi is the 8th factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. This is not a discussion of samadhi, which is a rich topic, but as some of you may know, the Buddha defined samadhi as what are called the 4 material jhanas. These are states of extreme concentration, serenity, and stillness. Each of the jhanas has mind states called jhana factors. In the first jhana, the primary factor is rapture or joy or bliss. Although it's extremely pleasant, it's a highly charged state. In the second jhana, the primary factor is called sukha in Pali. It means happiness, but it's happiness in the sense of contentment. You feel like you don't need or want anything. It is less intense than the first jhana. It's more relaxed and pleasant and serene. The fourth jhana has equanimity as its primary factor, and the third jhana has both sukha and upekkha, equanimity. In each jhana, there can be a sense that I am experiencing the jhana. 90% of what you experience is the rapture or the contentment and so on, but the other 10% is saying that I am experiencing the rapture or I am experiencing the contentment. As with our worldly experiences, this sense of I is getting in the way of the purity of the jhana. And if you can see this and let go of the sense of I, once again the experience becomes pure. There's only the joy. There's only the contentment. This is why Buddhist monastics can live so happily as renunciates. What they experience in their meditation is greater than any happiness you can know in the conventional world. It is as if you'd only ever eaten at McDonald's, and one day someone took you to a gourmet restaurant. You had this fabulous meal. The idea of even going back to McDonald's was not very enticing. Finally, let me say this. I hope this is not too inaccessible, but let me summarize the main points I made, and hopefully at least some of this will speak to you. The first point is that you are a process. Left to its own devices, which is what most people do, this process will continue to reinforce and enhance whatever qualities you already have. But by using the teachings of the Buddha as a guide, we can develop and cultivate qualities that are beneficial and abandon qualities that are harmful. The second point is about the importance of developing a healthy sense of self. This is done by cultivating good qualities, by being a good person, a noble person. This is how we develop confidence and security. Virtue is a safe haven. Like the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, it is a refuge. The third and final point is about the benefits of letting go of a sense of self entirely. This diminishes the power of negative mind states and enhances the benefits of positive ones. And in our meditation, we can learn deep levels of letting go and experience joy and happiness that would otherwise be unimaginable. In the 19th century, Western scholars referred to this rather quaintly as ecstasy. That's a little over the top, but I think you get the idea. Buddhism gets a bad name because of the emphasis on suffering. But it is the third noble truth that is the important one. That is the end of suffering. I heard this story recently, and it always makes me smile. Referring back to our 19th century Western scholars, they were just beginning to learn about Buddhism. They kept reading about suffering. But the Buddhist monastics they met were all happy people. Their conclusion was that the monastics didn't understand their own religion. I think this is hilarious. This is a path of joy. Joy shows up in many of the Buddha's famous lists. It is a factor of awakening. It is the primary factor of the first jhana. Empathetic joy is the third of the four Brahmaviharas, the noble abidings. Buddhist practice isn't some necessary evil. It isn't some Sisyphean task. Non-self is not a negation of who and what you are. It's a way of freeing yourself from a behavior that creates suffering and prevents you from greater forms of happiness. This path should make you happy even when things aren't going perfectly. You can at least delight in the fact that you have found the Dharma. It is the greatest gift you can ever receive. It is priceless, and no one can take it from you. Thank you for the gift of your attention.